B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, January 30th, 2020. Your humble host wants to alert you that I'm going to take a winter break starting on Tuesday, which means I will miss my immediate commentary on the outcome of the Iowa caucuses and the State of the Union message. That's going to be a circus. But I have some important news that will probably not have a lasting impact. But this is a moment to savor. Because today the House of Representatives finally, after years of effort led by Oakland Congresswoman Barbara Lee, they have passed repeal of the blank check that was given to George W. Bush after 9/11. It's under the cumbersome acronym AUMF for Authorization of Military Force. And I describe it as a blank check because it was so open-ended, authorizing presidential military deployments and acts of war for almost anything related to what we thought were the sources of the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And historically, we know that only Barbara Lee had the courage and the conscience to vote against it. And this is not totally meaningful because the Senate will not pass it. And coming out of impeachment, Trump will be encouraged and empowered, and he will grab more encouragement and more power than anybody intends. And we could see some real stretches of authoritarian use of presidential power. But the intention of the House is to withdraw the blank check and to send a signal that it doesn't want to see the president engage in unilateral military action against Iran or any other adversary in the near future. And again, it is an expression. I wish that it would become law, but of course it would have to pass the Senate and by a margin that survives a presidential veto. So for the moment, we'll just have to call it aspirational. And this is something that I think leads to further discussion that's really necessary about war powers, about the way the Congress has really bypassed its authority and allowed presidents of both parties to conduct military action without a declaration of war, much less one of these less impactful authorizations for use of military force. And this takes center stage in my mind because we have Dateline Prince Sultan Air Base, Saudi Arabia today. The U.S. troop presence there has grown to 2,500 since last summer. Now, keep in mind that the original irritant cited by Osama bin Laden when he issued his fatwa, his declaration of war against the United States about 1997, was that there were U.S. troops deployed on the soil, the holy soil, of Saudi Arabia. And while our troops are now in tents, not in the Khobar towers that somebody blew up, this is a dangerous step. This invites more retaliation for the U.S. presence in the Middle East. And we're doubling down in Iraq, where we have been asked to leave by the current government and its parliament. But we're not only rejecting that. In our arrogance, we have announced 3 new sites for military bases near the border with Iran. And, quoting from Mint Press News and the voice of writer Alan McLeod, the news will come as a shock to the Iraqi parliament, which earlier this month voted overwhelmingly to expel American forces from the country. The U.S. has flatly refused to leave. At this time, any delegation sent to Iraq would be dedicated to discussing how to best recommit our strategic partnership. Discussing? Soldiers don't discuss. They point their weapons at people. That is according to a statement from a spokesperson at the State Department. They continued, "We strongly urge Iraqi leaders to reconsider the importance of the ongoing economic and security relationship between the two countries. We believe it is in the shared interests of the U.S. and Iraq to continue fighting the Islamic State together." But that's not what we're trying to do. We are staging for some sort of a confrontation with Iran. And clearly, Iraq doesn't want to be the staging grounds for that. McLeod also notes that the Million-Man March last Friday in Baghdad likely produced over 2 million participants, described in the U.S. media as 10,000, or it was up to 250,000 in later reports by the New York Times. So these are troubling moments. And the article at Mint Press News includes a graphic, and I'm just going to share with you briefly here. Consider that within striking distance of Iran, on the border nation, in the border nation of Afghanistan, we have currently 14,000. In Iraq, it's 6,000. Their neighbor, which also borders Iran, Kuwait, 13,000. We have 3,000 troops in Jordan, 7,000 in Bahrain, now 2,500 or 3,000 in Saudi Arabia, and 13,000 in Qatar. And if you spend any time on Facebook, you may have seen that graphic saying, look how Iran put its country next to all of our military bases. And that is the twisted situation in that region right now. Well, today, the first American case of the coronavirus blamed on China has been reported to be transmitted to a second human being. This is the case of a woman from Chicago in her 60s. She returned from Wuhan, China, about a week ago. She was diagnosed with the coronavirus, and now her husband, who had not gone to China with her, recently began showing symptoms and was isolated in a hospital in Chicago. And today the World Health Organization met, and they did approve a resolution to declare an international public health emergency. Now, if I can just treat this lightly for a moment, I realize it's scaring a lot of people. But why doesn't Trump just put 100% tariffs on the coronavirus? That would stop it cold at the Chinese border, wouldn't it? Now, more seriously, this is the kind of crisis that our laws give presidential authority to temporarily close the border or limit travel and migration into the United States from a country where, for example, the coronavirus might be transmitted and brought to American shores. Not the kind of emotional, fear-based travel bans mostly aimed at Muslims that the Supreme Court has permitted our tempestuous authoritarian president to impose. So currently there are 170 deaths attributed to the coronavirus in China. More than 7,700 cases have been confirmed. There are millions of people in China who are locked down, and it's twisted and sick. But Wilbur, I wanted to call him Wilbur Mills, Wilbur Ross, who is Trump's commerce secretary and a billionaire by brutalizing corporations, he suggested this is good for America. And he said he didn't want to gloat about it or take a victory lap. But his ill-timed comments suggest that Chinese production will be reduced and that will cause American companies to open factories in the United States. And who the hell is he kidding? An important story at Consortium News today under the byline of Craig Murray, the retired British ambassador, an ally of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and a man who is pretty good at ferreting out the truth. And I want you to understand the context and the limitations about what I'm going to report here. What Craig Murray argues in this column today is that the report from a Freedom of Information request confirms that the FBI does have files that mention Seth Rich. And you know Seth Rich, we're not allowed to talk about him. There is a whole blackout because his family says it's disrespectful to suggest that he might have been the insider at the DNC who grabbed the files and passed them to WikiLeaks. And Craig Murray, who will go as far as saying he went to Washington to pick up a thumb drive with DNC files on it. Craig Murray does not assert anything specific about Seth Rich. But what he does tell us is that the FOIA requests have produced documents that show that the FBI has been lying, because they've repeatedly said in affidavits that the FBI has no records regarding Seth Rich. And now we see the release of an email originated by Peter Strzok, the discredited FBI agent, Wednesday, August 10th, 2016. We see some of the recipients, but many are blacked out. The subject line is forward, Seth Rich. And the message from Strzok is very brief. Just FYSA, I squashed this with blank. So we don't really know what this means. And Craig Murray, I've linked to his piece. You can read the details here. He does have some informed speculation about what the nature of these emails were and speculation about who might have read them, including one higher executive at the FBI because of different formatting in the email. But the bottom line here is that we have been told we can't talk about Seth Rich, we can't speculate. The case is closed, even though it's not. He was murdered at 4 a.m. on the streets of Washington, D.C., and if it was a robbery, well, they didn't want anything that he had. And so it remains a mystery that I believe deserves full investigation, like so many other elements that were never pursued by the St. Bob Mueller investigation, which is why I refer to it as a limited hangout investigation and report. My thanks to Linda Lewis, who passed along a couple of great tips for today's podcast, including this report that the $50 million libel lawsuit brought by Tulsi Gabbard, presidential candidate from Hawaii, against Hillary Clinton for claiming that she was a Russian tool, Russian asset, is the actual language. Well, there was an attempt to serve the papers at the Clinton mansion in Chappaqua, New York. But a Secret Service agent blocked the process server from being able to deliver it personally to Clinton. And, the process server is supposed to actually touch the recipient with the envelope or the package. But conveniently for Hillary, her security detail intervened and said, no, you can't do that here. You got to send it to her lawyer at Williams and Connolly in Washington, D.C. And, it just shows the games that people play. And here's a game being played over at the Democratic National Committee. In recent days, we have reported how Tom Perez, the hand-picked leader who was imposed on the DNC to prevent progressive Keith Ellison from taking the chair after Debbie Wasserman Schultz stank it up in 2016, and Donna Brazile was the temporary interim leader of the party. Well, members of the Budget Committee, and this occurred during the same sequence of events last weekend, where Tom Perez stacked all of the committees at the DNC and for the convention and the platform process with Clinton loyalists, with corporate Democrats, with the knowledge that Bernie Sanders is on the upswing and very well could be the nominee. Now, if that's the case, Tom Perez's days as head of the DNC may be numbered. So his buddies on the Budget Committee, they passed a little package. 4 months' salary to be paid within 2 weeks of a resignation by Perez or two of his top deputies, the CEO, Seema Nanda, and the deputy CEO, Sam Cornali. Now, all three have said they didn't ask for it, they don't want the money, they won't accept it. And Perez says that he will serve through the end of the election in November. But I think this shows that they're worried inside the DNC. If they're planning the exit package, it's not much of a parachute, but it is a parachute. Well, it seems to follow logically with the efforts to stack those committees with all of the Clinton allies. And now I want to take a swipe at some of the well-intentioned lefties in the Democratic Party. And it was about a week, 10 days ago, that this open letter surfaced, signed by Noam Chomsky, Barbara Ehrenreich, Bill Fletcher, Leslie Kagan, Ron Daniels, Kathy Kelly, my pal Norman Solomon, Cynthia Peters, and Michael Albert. And their open letter is encouraging the Green Party and other third parties to go away. Now, they don't use that language. And the letter is written gently. They try not to, demonize the third party lefties. But it is condescending in its intent. They are saying that the situation is so severe that we can't risk a Jill Stein, Michigan of 2016. I don't believe she cost Hillary the election there, but that's the urban myth. Or the Ralph Nader 2000. And this is so demeaning to people who have left the Democratic Party like I have. And I don't have a home in a third party on a permanent basis. I'm a floater. But if people believe that the Green Party or the Peace and Freedom Party is the way to express their political values, who is Noam Chomsky to tell them to sit down, shut up, because this is an emergency, and the Democratic Party is in such bad shape that we cannot rely on it to deliver a victory over Donald Trump. And so we're going to tell you third-party people to stay out of the way this year. Now, I am liberally paraphrasing from the message that was sent. But today at Mint Press, Roger Harris, who is described as an activist for the Peace and Freedom Party here in California, writes a thoughtful but pretty firm pushback. He said, the best way for Democrats to avoid losing votes to a progressive third party is to preempt their issues for combating global warming, reducing income inequality, dismantling the national security state, and ending militarism. Removing a third-party challenge from the left is tantamount to encourage Democrats to shift to the right with the assurance that their progressive-leaning captured constituencies, like ethnic minorities and labor, have nowhere else to go. That's the kind of wedge politics that I was talking about yesterday. More from Harris. The open letter calls for progressive third parties to capitulate even before the Democratic presidential candidate has been chosen and the platform drafted. Now, I can imagine a letter like this in October in battleground states. But it should be an appeal and not a demand. And I found this to be a little bit too much in the direction of the demand side. I've linked to Mr. Harris's rebuttal, and you can find it in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. I don't really consider this news, but Pete Buttigieg is trying to hold on to the early lead that he had in Iowa. It has been sliced by both Senator Sanders and, to some extent, by Joe Biden, with whom he is more politically aligned. And so the big news is that at a campaign event in Iowa yesterday, Pete Buttigieg called out his rivals by name. Now, all he said was, in dismissing disputes between the two men over the Iraq War and Social Security, he says this isn't the time to get caught up in reliving arguments from before. The less 2020 resembles 2016 in our party, whatever that means, the better. So, I think that's just ordinary campaigning, and I don't find it particularly newsworthy. Here's the strongest thing he said about Bernie. I hear Senator Sanders calling for a kind of politics that says you got to go all the way here or nothing else counts. It's coming at a moment when we actually have a historic majority, not just a line around what it is we're against, but agreeing on what it is we're for. Well, I know he's appealing to many voters, but I find him to be, a rising star who could have potential in the future. but not a significant player in this race here in 2020. And this kind of gave me a laugh. Many of Buttigieg's campaign stops have the words turn the page spelled out in large blue letters behind the stage. Now, they should give credit to Barack Obama. He used that cliche repeatedly in 2008 when he was making the case that he was the younger, brighter candidate facing off against Senator John McCain. It's also a Bob Seger song that I got tired of about the third time I heard it. Turn the page. Elizabeth Warren is trying to breathe some new life into her flagging campaign in Iowa, despite the fact that she, of course, is stuck in Washington, D.C. for the Trump trial. Her new bus tour that I guess she'll be on maybe Saturday or Sunday, depending on how all this plays out, has slogans like courage over cynicism, hope over fear. And the stakes are pretty high. I watched Elizabeth Warren just bulldoze Judy Woodruff on the public television news hour. It would have been on Tuesday evening. And, Woodruff was asking her decent questions, but Warren had pre-planned comments that she was going to deliver no matter what the question was. I mean, Woodruff could have said, hey, did you have liverwurst for lunch? And Warren would have just jumped into her stump speech. And then I saw her later the same evening in a longer interview with Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, and she did the same thing. So she's clearly feeling pressure. I'm not going to call it desperation, but she's feeling pressure to turn out voters, produce some sort of a second or third place finish in the caucuses in Iowa. One of the problems, as you know, is she's polling at around 13-14%, and in each caucus setting, you have to clear the 15% barrier. And so if Warren's support in the first round is at 12%, her caucus supporters have to pick another candidate. And we hear the jockeying that Yang is steering his delegates, his caucus goers, to Sanders. Biden is trying to make deals with Klobuchar. And I really have no idea how all of that horse trading is going to play out. But virtually every poll predicts that Bernie Sanders will be at the top of the heap at the end of the caucuses on Monday night. In Cleveland during the Christmas holidays, a solid Trump supporter named Darrell Scott, who's African-American, held the a rally with his organization, the Urban Revitalization Coalition. And this is an effort to attract black voters to the Trump coalition. And to try to stimulate involvement, Darrell Scott handed out thousands of dollars of cash stuffed in envelopes for an event that was advertised as a $25,000 cash giveaway. I mean, I see Indian casinos do that all the time. Now, I laugh at this because it is, I think, a desperate effort to present at least photo evidence that there are some blacks who support Trump. And I laugh because it's a playbook, a page from Democratic playbooks of the past. When I was in Chicago, when you went to vote, your precinct captain gave you some walking around money. It was after you voted, and he checked which way you voted. And in Oakland in the 1990s, Elihu Harris, who was the mayor once, he got caught handing out coupons for free chicken dinners during public events. I don't know that they were explicitly campaign events. I want to recommend a powerful op-ed by Ken Ward, one of the valve turners. If you recall, in October of 2016, a group of activists concerned about climate change, 5 groups spread across 4 states, and they shut down all 5 pipelines carrying Canadian tar sands oil into the U.S. for a day. And some of the cases have ended with a prison sentence, some with acquittals. But Ken Ward is now on his 3rd trial. The first one a hung jury, the second one a split jury. And they're really determined to convict him. But the real insult is that he and his activist friends are now listed with Dylan Roof. He's the one who shot up the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Robert Deere, who shot up with an AK-47 Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood. And Micah Johnson, who killed 5 cops in a shooting spree in Dallas. The DHS, Homeland Security, lists those criminals with the pipeline activists, who are described as suspected environmental rights extremists and therefore worthy of ongoing scrutiny. Down by the border, the Trump wall has been going up in some sections. And in the last 24 hours, I don't have an exact moment, but a section of the border wall just blew right over on its side. They're not telling us how strong the gusty winds were, but apparently a section of wall was under construction, and they hadn't yet put the concrete anchors in place. But this occurs after the revelation that Customs has exposed a tunnel more than a mile long right under the border. And the idea that walls will not be blown down, that they will not be tunneled under, it's just obvious to everyone. Ladders will be used. People get blowtorches out and cut a hole in the wall. It's sad, it really is. Also sad is that there's a group of men who are locked up in Louisiana, who are in the 4th month of a hunger strike, protesting that they have been denied asylum in the United States, and they are waiting for a judge to hear their cases. The men are all from South Asia, not Mexico or Guatemala or Honduras. They're seeking asylum out of fear of religious persecution or retaliation for their political views back home. Will they survive their own hunger strike? Well, at least one of the men is being force-fed, and the others may be subjected to that as well. Tomorrow it is official. The United Kingdom has exited the European Union. Brexit becomes official at 11 p.m. London time, midnight Brussels time, and the final documents were traded by email as the EU members went through a perfunctory vote to approve the exit of Britain. News broke this morning that one of the founders and lead singer of the Kingston Trio has passed away. His name was Bob Shane, and he was 85 years old. And I mention this because the Kingston Trio came up in my latest podcast interview that I'm posting today with author Brad Schreiber. And Brad has a great new book out called Music is Power. And he describes many artists and many of their songs that had such a really powerful political impact, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. And in this excerpt, he talks about James Brown, one of my favorite artists, and how he blew it by becoming or trying to become a political ally of Richard Nixon.
It's heartbreaking to think how amazing that James Brown was as a performer, and where would we have found funk music if not for him? And in 68, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud became an anthem for an entire race of people in this country. And yet he made a calculated decision that became a tragic error. And that is he approached Richard Nixon because he was the first who tried to get a Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. And Nixon, quote unquote, played him. He posed with James Brown. In no way did he make any effort to create a national holiday. And then James Brown started a downward spiral in terms of his followers. They were holding up signs at his concerts. Instead of saying Soul Brother Number One, they were saying Sold Out Brother Number One. And we know about the downhill slide from there. But a remarkable performer, and the movie about him, Get On Up with Chadwick Boseman is, you can say whatever you want about the script, but the performance and the nature of how he grew up and how he needed respect from people and how he had to be in control. It's all there. All the things that made him great and made him vulnerable.
Yeah. That's author Brad Schreiber talking about his new book, Music is Power, and about James Brown and his ill-fated efforts to align with Richard Nixon in exchange for the Martin Luther King holiday, which came much later under the Reagan administration. It's a great interview, and I hope you'll check it out. It's kind of a change of pace from all the depressing politics that we've been covering. We go back to some of the depressing politics of the past, but the music that we celebrate is interesting and fun, and I hope you will check it out at your convenience. Also, I want to pause, as I usually do, to thank people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Susan Lewis, who converted a Republican to listen to this podcast, John Morgan, and Jim Garrison, Carl Howard. They each chip in $5 to $20 a month to support this little outfit, and you can do it too. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page. You can choose the level of support you want. You can also send a one-time contribution through PayPal, or you can load it up with a stamp and put it in the mail to Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, this question and answer process in the Senate trial of Donald Trump for impeachment is boring and predictable, and it's really hard to watch. There are these long pauses while they wait for the question to be delivered and the Chief Justice to read over it. The only real clash is that Senator Rand Paul's effort to ask a question that names the alleged whistleblower that triggered this whole Ukraine flap was rejected by the Chief Justice, who simply said that he declined to read the question. And that was pretty much how that fizzled out. But it's been used. The Republicans ask questions that advance the interests of the president, and the Democrats ask questions that advance the case of the House managers for impeachment. And so I think it's pretty much a waste of time. I'd really rather hear the senators debate this, live. But that's not in the offing. And as the events wind down to the crucial vote on Friday, keep in mind that the vote before the Senate is a vote about whether to vote on bringing in witnesses. And the Republicans at least are projecting publicly that they are fully confident that there are not 4 defectors who will cause that vote to go the other way, lead to an extension of the trial, the whole negotiation over witnesses, and the process of bringing them to the Senate. The possibility of objections from the White House over executive privilege and how those would be evaluated and adjudicated. And so really the next 24 hours are crucial. This is where we're going to find out just how craven the Republicans are. And if I had to predict, I don't think it's going to lead to a vote for witnesses. These people are so programmed, brainwashed, cultified, that they really fear the wrath of Donald Trump more than they honor their oath to the Constitution and the specific oath they took to conduct a fair trial in this impeachment proceeding. And that's why it really does have devastating implications for the future of what is left of our system. Because this can take whatever accountability the Democrats could bring to Donald Trump or to anybody in his orbit going forward, and if there is a second term, devastating is really the only word that I think fits. So the Democrats are trying everything. Adam Schiff, they've gone to extraordinary lengths to put a muzzle on John Bolton because they fear what he has to say, because they already know the president's scheme has been exposed. And it is remarkable that the Republicans can maintain their denial when there is so much information available to all of us. Lev Parnas, John Bolton, Don McGahn, the former White House chief of staff, the Michael Cohen plea deal. We know this is a corrupt and criminal president. And they are maintaining their stout denial, as if that is obvious to everyone, and that they can use these process arrangements basically just to beat the vote because they have the majority, and then claim with a straight face, the House managers didn't prove their case. Well, they didn't prove their case because Trump obstructed them. And we all lose. Here's Mike Rounds of South Dakota. I personally have heard enough. For me, I don't believe we have to go into closed deliberations. I'm ready to vote. James Inhofe of Oklahoma. I don't think that would accomplish anything, he says, about the vote for witnesses. And the Republicans are encouraging the public to think that they're going to move immediately from a winning vote to block witnesses to a vote to acquit the president and end the trial. And that could happen with almost lightning speed tomorrow. So here are the details on the effort by Rand Paul to insert his question. The way he wrote it, it wouldn't explicitly say that the man's name made him the whistleblower, but it would open questions about it. And when it was presented to the Chief Justice, this is the most definitive thing he's done during this trial. Quote, the presiding officer declines to read the question as submitted. And that was that. Now, the Democrats are hinting that they have stalling tactics, parliamentary maneuvers. Nancy Pelosi is making a kind of moral case that if they close down this impeachment trial and exonerate the president without witnesses, quote, he will not be acquitted. You cannot be acquitted if you don't have a trial. You don't have a trial if you don't have witnesses and documentation and all of that. The fate of our nation is riding on how this is resolved. It isn't about just one person. It's about the precedent that it sets for the future. But the Republicans only care about this president, not about any goddamn precedent. And there we are, with people like Doug Jones, the wobbly Democrat from Alabama. Now, he is saying that he might vote to acquit Trump on one charge, the obstruction of Congress. That's the one that is so obvious. You know, you can get laid in the weeds about Ukrainegate, and I've argued that all along. But his obstruction has been open, brazen, repeated, continued, and it hasn't stopped. Speculation also that Joe Manchin, I saw him on TV last night. He's the West Virginia Republican, and they think he might be a defector. And Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, barely a Democrat. So I try not to get too depressed here and pass that along to you, but I have to concede that I'm 66 years old. My first big story when I was working in radio in the 1970s was Watergate, and the system worked. We forced a corrupt president out of office. Wasn't perfect. But without that prospect going forward, we descend into an authoritarian state where the Constitution and the three branches of government are just window dressing. Well, finally today, let's take a look at the most bizarre arguments that were offered yesterday in the response to questions by Alan Dershowitz, law professor emeritus from Harvard, and a criminal law professor who is trespassing in constitutional law these days. He told senators that presidents can't be impeached for using their powers of office to boost their own political fortunes as long as they believe their reelection is best for the country. I'll paraphrase. A narcissistic president is well within his rights to conduct foreign policy in a way that benefits him because, well, he believes that he is good for the nation. More from Dersh. Every public official I know believes that his election's in the public interest, and mostly you're right. Your election is in the public interest. And if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. Now, this shatters rational thinking, American law, jurisprudence, in my opinion. Chuck Schumer called it a load of nonsense. By Dershowitz logic, President Nixon did nothing wrong in Watergate. He was just breaking into the Democratic National Committee to help his reelection, which of course is in the public interest according to Dershowitzian logic. Oh, I like that. Listener Linda Lewis said, I was stunned like many people by the Dershowitz argument. World leaders are very prone to the syndrome grandiose narcissism, and thus are highly unlikely to ever concede that their actions run counter to the public interest. But if Dershowitz also suffers, he wouldn't see the fallacy of his argument. And she linked to a commentary by Jonathan Turley, who's kind of caught in the middle here. He allowed himself to be used by the Republicans in the House impeachment inquiry. On Monday, he said that he generally supported the Dershowitz argument. Here's what he said in USA Today. While I praised Dershowitz's presentation of his theory on Monday as cogently and powerfully argued, I still believe he's fundamentally wrong in maintaining that impeachable offenses must be based on actual crimes or crime-like conduct. However, the tight argument on Monday seemed to gradually lose more and more definition with every hour and day. Dershowitz declared that every public official I know believes, I just quoted that. Here's the reaction from Turley. It was a surprising and baffling statement. Where his definition of impeachable offenses would proscribe too little, this argument would protect too much in presidential misconduct. Clearly, everything a president does will come with a patina of politics. However, this argument would make that common denominator into an absolute defense. It's like saying that the Navy cannot commit maritime crimes carried out in water. Politics is the common element of presidential conduct, just as water is the common element of naval action. That is why the argument becomes circular. Presidents can't be impeached for politics, but he argues all is politics for presidents. To use a Simpson-like construct, that's the O.J. trial, if it is political, there must be acquittal. There's more in the commentary, and if I can find the link, I'll put it up in the show file for today's podcast. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it with absolutely everyone, and I give it away free every day. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.